Okay, so let's go through a quick history. This is probably one of the first Doctor Who games. This is only the first official Doctor Who games. The first adventure on the BBC Micro back in 1983. And there were 4 levels. And the levels were sort of based on the games that were popular at the time. So they were based on video game genres. So you had a sort of Pac-Man-like game, a Frogger-like game, a Space Invaders game, and a Battleships game. And you can sort of see at this point why Doctor Who was sort of being part of this sort of discourse that video game tie-ins were not actually very good, because as you can see, they probably weren't very good. But they were sort of basically taking preconceived video game models, and they were just sort of adapting a veneer of Doctor Who, which largely was presented on the cover. We have the Warlord, which followed in 1985, which was just purely text. No video game, there was no graphics at all. You had to type in where you wanted to go, what you said. It was a sort of very, for these days, I would probably considered a very bare bones sort of game. But it did have 250 locations, which for 1985 was pretty good. And its connection to Doctor Who was quite significant, as it was actually designed by a former Doctor Who producer. But again, you can see why, while this is actually, nowadays, people look back and sort of say this has actually got some quality to it. At the time, you can see why, again, people say, is this really Doctor Who? I want to be in the TARDIS, I want to see the TARDIS, I want to see Daleks. There's none of that. You had to imagine it all. The Mines of Terror. Now we get a little more graphic-y. And we have the Doctor and his cat, called Sphinx, wandering around. No Daleks, Doctor Who can be quite complicated because the Daleks aren't directly owned by the BBC. You can start to see a slightly more graphical content, and as you can notice, we're seeing it appearing on a few more different, it's not just the BBC Micro anymore, Commodore 64, AMSTRAD, they are now being part of the Doctor Who experience as video game industry is starting to grow, and the more games are coming out from multiple systems. By 1992, Doctor Who's off the air, but Dalek Attack appears, which was actually quite a good little game, but it was heavily based on nostalgia. Doctor Who was no longer there, so it was just filled with visual notions of Doctor Who, but the actual bare bones of it, again, was just a platformer. You were running around, the Doctor was using his sonic screwdriver to shoot people, and people were trying to shoot him, and he was jumping, but there was lots of little things in there. You could play different Doctors. There was different levels were relevant to different eras of Doctor Who. There was Dalek Invasion, Skyro. It was a sort of fun game, but it was just, again, the aesthetics of Doctor Who. The gameplay wasn't really modelled around it. And at this point, we're still at the point here where maybe you could argue that the technology really wasn't there to adapt something which was as I say, which is so non-linear as Doctor Who. Destiny of the Doctors in 1997. Which again was a very nostalgia fest. There was no Doctor Who on television. There had been a TV movie the year before that had failed. And this was very much a return to looking back at Doctor Who. What made this interesting was that you actually had one of the previous actors from Doctor Who, who used to play the Master, Anthony Ainley. He reappeared to do these cutscenes. So for the first time we saw something where there was a certain amount of connection with Doctor Who, something that was deliberately more than just an aesthetic over the top of a previous model of gameplay, like a platformer or Pac-Man. Here we had something, you roamed around the TARDIS as what actually seemed like a drunk bubble, which moved like a drunk bubble, it was really hard to control, and you'd meet Daleks, and you'd meet different Doctors. It had the voices of the Doctors in there. I spoke to a producer from this game once, and he said that when they were producing it, Tom Baker, who was the 4th Doctor, came in to do his lines. And he came in and he stood in the doorway, and I will paraphrase because what he says is perhaps not there for children, but he said, what sort of crap have you got for me to do today? And again, perhaps suggesting that the idea of video games had no real value even to the people involved in Doctor Who. It was a silly notion. That being said, Anthony Ainley is great in this. If you find him, if you go onto YouTube and put in Destiny of the Doctors and watch his bits, they're so beautifully hammy. He just has so much fun at it. It's great. He does the longest laugh I've ever seen. It's like that Austin Powers one where they do the laugh for too long, the enemies. He does that. There's no reason for it. It's not a joke. He just carries on. It's incredible. So we do get a sort of a bit of a dearth in Doctor Who games between 97 and around about 2010. There was a few things. There was a Trumps game. The card game Trumps was adapted for the PlayStation, I think it was. And that, but you know, it wasn't really about Doctor Who. It was really just about adapting Trumps with a Doctor Who. So it's a licensing thing. This is pretty much one of the first things that started to appear once Doctor Who came back. I suppose we should also very quickly mention there were a few sort of online games that the BBC did when Doctor Who came back as part of their promotion, as sort of like extras that you could actually enjoy while Doctor Who was being aired. But this is perhaps one of the bigger video games that came out, and it was by the BBC. And what made this sort of fairly interesting was that I was working at the same time as this came out on another video game on Doctor Who called Return to Earth. And the producer on that was talking about this in a meeting, and he was sort of saying it's ridiculous. The BBC think they can make video games themselves. How laughable is that? And incidentally, this was a really good video game, and the one we were working on was absolutely terrible. So it just shows that, you know, you can't quite make those choices, those assumptions. And this video game was actually quite good. It was downloadable, it was for free, because it was done through the BBC, so they weren't there to make money out of it. It was well rendered, it had the cast doing the voices. It was almost, I think, considered part of the franchise as well. So when we talk about world building, this here was actually meant to be part of the universe of Doctor Who. It wasn't just some media platform making it, some video game just making a story about Doctor Who. It was meant to be connected to the Doctor Who universe. So in a sense, doing this game was being part of Doctor Who. It was one of those real first times where they were trying to sort of say, hey, you are the Doctor, or you are playing an episode of Doctor Who. But it took, you know, you think the first one was 1983, it took to 2010 till we started to get to this stage where perhaps we could tackle Doctor Who in a reasonable way. And as you can see, they did 5 downloadable games too. The City of the Daleks, Blood of the Cybermen, TARDIS, Shadows of Vashta Nerada, and the Gunpowder Plot. So you've got a wide range of genre Doctor Who. The Gunpowder Plot and the TARDIS, City of the Daleks, all very, very different. These are the 2 that I worked on. I'll talk about those in a little bit. In 2012, The Eternity Clock returned us back to the platformer. It's a good game, but it was just a straight platformer, but it had the aesthetics again. The aesthetics of Doctor Who were mapped on it. So the voices, the sounds, the special effects, the visuals. But it was essentially, you were playing a video game with this sort of licensing veneer on the top. Worlds of Time. Here we have an online game, or one of the first online games, and I'm surprised they never did this sooner, where it was an MMO, a massively multiplayer online game, where you could join for free. It was freemium design, so there were bonuses within the game that you could buy. But basically, you all came in together. It was also expandable, which is for the first time we see Doctor Who in what we're seeing far more now, where games are updated constantly. So there were constant updates to this game, to change it, to vary it, and inevitably to make it better. And for a story like Doctor Who, which is ever going, ever changing, the tone is ever changing, the amount of characters are always growing as well, and the principal characters are always changing, this is quite a good way to actually work on a Doctor Who video game, where you can update it, because the show keeps updating. We've got Legacy. Has anyone played this on the PC? Yeah. It's actually a really good game. It's just a jewel-based game, one of those where you have to get jewels into a certain order to make them disappear. But the way that it actually adapts Doctor Who to it, and it gives it a storyline, you have different characters with different techniques, and they can be expanded and they can be improved, updated. They go up levels, and they can affect this board. As I say, that you had this ongoing storyline, and it was constantly updated, so it was constantly changing, constantly adding new characters as new episodes appeared. So it was running concurrently with the series. So here we see a tie-in where we're actually seeing something which you could perhaps argue is as relevant as the show, insofar that it's working concurrently with the show. The show would do a week where there would be a new monster appear on the show. Within the next week, they would have it in their game, and you could actually get that monster or that character. So that was, again, a very big change. And finally on our list, we have Lego Dimensions. Doctor Who, which is a sort of more... It's not actually Doctor Who, it's not the video game. You know, it's not a singular thing with Doctor Who. Doctor Who is part of a multi-franchise thing here. All the franchises are converging on this one franchise, which is again itself an adaptation, comes from Lego. So Lego goes to video games and it pulls in all these other franchises: Batman, Lord of the Rings, Doctor Who, and Doctor Who was one level pack that you could get, which again played with as much as it could with Doctor Who and had various settings, and was trying to get round this whole issue, as I say, of Doctor Who not having a set world and actually being
very, very open-ended. Okay, so very quickly, I thought also we could look at as games which aren't official, which were inspired by Doctor Who. And this is a particularly good one. Has anyone played XCOM? Yes, I know the ones down here have. Anyone else played XCOM? Oh, no? No? Julian Gallop, who did XCOM, fantastic designer. He's done loads of games throughout throughout video game history. One of the first things he did was a board game, or he was making his own board game for his friends, which was called Time Lords, or it was called Doctor Who. I'm not sure which he went for at that time. But the idea is that you could go to different zones where you could battle each other, but you could also go to different zones in different time zones. And if you went to a time zone before the one that's already been won, you could change the outcome of a previous victory, which is quite a smart idea. There's like a temporal level to a board game. And they adapted this for the BBC Micro, just for fun. And then it was picked up by a very small publishing company called Redshift, and they made it into Time Lords, and other people could play it. But this was done for fun. It was not done as a cash cow. It was not done for money. It was done for love. And as I say, he's one of the biggest designers. I think he's a British designer as well. British designers in video games at the moment. But this is where he came from. This is where he stemmed from. If you can find it, it's a really hard game to play. I tried it. It was very confusing, but I love the idea. So cool. Dr. Watt in 1986. Now, as you can see, this isn't official, but it is a lot of fun. If you can find this it is legally allowed on emulators, this one. If you can find it, it is a lot of fun. It's an adventure. You play Dr. Y, Dr. What, Dr. When, but never Doctor Who. And you go around searching for things in different time zones. You can swap between your doctors. You all have TARDISes, and you all go to different areas. It was a really clever way, a very tongue-in-cheek way of trying to simulate the universe of Doctor Who in 1986. I have to say, it's one of the best versions I've seen, one of the best attempts, especially on such a low level of software technology. It's worth looking for. And finally, I just got to go through the dark side, which actually isn't really about Doctor Who at all, but just shows how a text from one different media can affect another. And in this, it was one of the first full 3D video games on personal computers. And on the Spectrum, it was very, very basic, but it was the first block 3D, and you could move around in this block 3D world. And there's one on the Amiga up there, which is a 16-bit rather than 8-bit computer. But the idea was that there were these little teleport pods in the game, and inside them they were bigger than they were on the outside, and they had these consoles. Never mentioned Doctor Who, but was just an aesthetic. It was just something which obviously inspired them in their creation of their world. Their world creation was inspired by Doctor Who. So again, I think it's interesting to see how tie-ins can affect us in ways other than just through the cash cow industry licensing. And finally, fan cultures. Here we see Doctor Who appearing in fan worlds like Minecraft and Second Life, where fans are building Doctor Who for themselves within sandbox environments. Both Minecraft and Second Life are virtual worlds where you can build your world, essentially, and people have. They've been building their own consoles and all sorts, but they are living in these worlds of Doctor Who. They've actually embraced the adaptation without the official license and purely out of love. Not for money, not for gain, just to immerse themselves and to imagine what it's like to live in the world of Doctor Who. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just go back to the 2010 game. I worked on both of these. Well, I worked on the pitching for both of these, and then I worked on Return to Earth. I didn't really work on Evacuation Earth. And this was done just as Matt Smith had been announced as the Doctor. So we had no idea what he'd look like. We had no idea what he'd wear. Well, we knew what he'd look like, but we didn't know how he would look. So we were going to do it for the Wii and the DS. So we had to be thinking of the two different platforms, which are very different. One's a handheld, and the other is a console. And one has a wand, and one has a stylus stick. And there was a lot of conversations over what they would be. And this is one of the things I just wanted to bring to on the whole cash cow approach of licensing. It was a horrendously difficult project because you've got a lot of fingers in the same pie. You've got the BBC, who've got very specific ideas of what they want. You've got the game company that I was working for, who pitched to the BBC, won the license, and then had to make the game. But they had to make the game based around what the BBC wanted. The BBC was fascinated with screwdrivers, sonic screwdrivers. They loved the idea of creating a sonic screwdriver wee wand, which you'd wave at the screen and do wonderful, exciting things with. But the problem is you get a screwdriver, you could wave it at the screen, but you could never do lovely, exciting things with it. They were always inherently boring. And the video game company was trying to plead with the BBC, saying, please, we don't want to use a sonic screwdriver. We don't want sonic screwdriver mini-games, because they're boring. The things like circuit boards, which you've got to move things around in a weird minigame, they said that people wouldn't want it, but the BBC pushed for it. Furthermore, the BBC had a deadline that it had to be done for, Christmas. Why Christmas? For sales. And so it had to be done by then, which again affects quality, because you have a deadline, you have a milestone you must hit regardless of where you are. And in any development is never a certain world. It can come with all sorts of hitches. You know, I could be ill for 3 weeks, and then, but you've still got that same time to get the artwork to the people. So it's a massively complicated and highly pressured way to make a game, because you're not just having to make a game, you're having to make a game to the stipulations of another third party. And furthermore, there's the money issue. And to be quite honestly, the people that made this game, Asylum, who made the Destiny of the Doctors game with the Master, I think they perhaps pitched a little cheekily. They probably said they could do it for a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time, probably knowing they couldn't. I think there was issues there. So there's a lot of issues around making a video game, but the core thing was the people who were making it, they were not lazy. They were not doing it for money. Glenn Parry, who was the producer, he worked days. He worked sort of 14, 15 hours days to try and make the milestone for this. We all worked really hard. And yes, okay, Nintendo may have voted it the worst game of 2010. Fine, that's okay. But ultimately, that wasn't the fault of the people making the game. It was the fault of the way that the game was structured within the industry, how the industry was affecting the game. And there's some more of the concepts of what sort of ideas that we thought we would have for the game. So basically, just very quickly, I worked from the script. The script was given to me. It was a terrible script. And then from the script, we did the storyboards. And this is the scene 11 in the video game. This was one of the outros, the very end outro, which was dropped. So we scripted, and all that money went in for me scripting, storyboarding all the scripts for all the intros and outros for all the levels. And only level 1 ever got made. But there, you can see there where the storyboards were moved into the game. But the whole idea would have been that the storyboards would be made into like a comic book game where the panels would slide in on each other and you would suddenly see the Doctor's face. Matt Smith would be talking and then it would move out. Then you'd see Amy's face and then that would move out. It was all meant to be dynamic and exciting. Money ran out. This was the only intro-outro scene to be made, was the first one. And then the rest was sort of just integrated into the gameplay or just dropped. And loads of areas of the script and the nuances of the script all disappeared because they had to make that milestone for that amount of money. So the take-home really, as I'm trying to say, is that yes, it was out to make money, yes, it was undercosted, and yes, it was there to rush to meet a commercial time frame. But those involved in it, they really cared about the game, and they were trying to do the best in their job within these sort of limitations. Lazy tie-ins are rarely lazy, just highly pressurized commodities. So I'll just run a quick conclusion. I think these, so what can we sort of learn from all this? Well, as I say here, the adapted concept world can be inserted into a game in single or multiple forms, as gameplay, as Time Lords shows, as story, as the Warlords showed, the one that was just text, as functions, where the sonic screwdriver becomes a really boring piece in Return to Earth, as video, as Anthony Ainley laughing too long in Destiny of the Doctors, or as aesthetics, just little homages added, as I showed you that teleport pod in the dark side. They can be world building. The game can be shaped and shape the existing world. We've not really seen that yet, I don't think, in Doctor Who, but we have seen it in other franchises. The Matrix is a famous one, where part of the video game was actually a second story within the Matrix, which, if you played the video game, it made sense and added extra to you actually watching The Matrix, the film, or The Matrix Reload. I can't remember which one it was, but... So in the sense, they can actually affect one another. They are catalysts to our world buildings, and I think this is really important. And I think this is something that we have a very snobbish value in life, in our culture. That world building You know, these games, they can be sort of like... I was saying this to Tom earlier. I remember, you know, when I was very, very, very young, my parents would say when they were very, very, very young that, you know, when they play cowboy and Indians, they'd pick a stick up and that would be their gun. Or they would use a broom and that would be their horse. You know, the fact the broom didn't look like the horse didn't matter. It catalyzed their imagination. It became the horse for them. And I think sometimes tie-ins can be like that. And those really basic ones in the 80s, even E.T. and Ghostbusters, they catalyzed imaginations for kids. I would play Ghostbusters on those personal computers, and even though the graphics were terrible and the story was terrible, to me they were just sort of pushing my imagination into that world. They were important to me. They may have been a cash cow for the industry, they may have been a pain for the parents with their wallets, but for me they meant something, like that stick for the cowboy. They can be nostalgic. Obviously, as we've said, they can remind us of something that was important to us, like when a show goes off the air. They can be immersive as well, such as Legacy or the adventure games, or maybe even the things like Minecraft and Second Life, where you actually exist within that world. The video games helps you exist within a world that you see on television. But they are commercial, and we can never hide from the fact that they are products, and their output is not solely creative, but shaped by industry forces. Deadlines, third-party influence. Incidentally, Disney was great for High School Musical. They were really nice. They were brilliant. And they don't have to be commercially driven, as I said, with Time Lords, Minecraft, Second Life. Adaptations, we need to get away from tie-ins being just solely about licenses. They can be about fans, and they can be about fun. And I think with that, I will leave it there.